You are 8 days old. You have no name, none. Not because your parents haven't chosen one, but because in the city where you were born, you are not yet considered a person worth naming. You've survived a week, which is the hard part, but the people around you are still waiting to see if you'll make it to day 8. Because in ancient Rome, roughly 1 in 3 babies died before their first birthday, and naming a child too early was, in a very real sense, tempting fate. So here you are, a nameless, swaddled bundle in a world with no antibiotics, no vaccines, no incubators, no understanding of germs, no thermometer, no formula, no pediatrician. A world where the man standing over you, your own father, holds the literal legal power to decide whether you live or die, and he hasn't decided yet. Stop and sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely difficult to comprehend from where we're sitting. Every single person watching this is the endpoint of an unbroken chain of babies who survived this exact gauntlet. Thousands of years of newborns who beat 1 in 3 odds over and over, generation after generation, with none of the tools we now consider the bare minimum. If even one of your Roman-era ancestors had lost that coin flip, you would not exist. You'd simply never have happened. So the question isn't just a historical curiosity. It's the story of how your bloodline survived its single most dangerous moment, repeated endlessly across centuries. How did Romans, with their primitive medicine and their brutal infant mortality, actually keep babies alive long enough to become the ancestors of half the modern world? The answer is stranger, darker, and more sophisticated than you'd ever expect. Let's go. Let's start with the moment of birth itself, because in Rome, it was nothing like what we picture today. There were no hospitals, no doctors in most cases. A Roman woman gave birth at home, and the person who delivered the baby was almost never a man. She was a midwife, in Latin, an obstetrix, and she was the single most important figure in those first terrifying minutes of a Roman life. The best midwives were genuinely skilled professionals. We know this because a Greek physician named Soranus of Ephesus, working in Rome in the early 2nd century AD, wrote an entire detailed treatise on gynecology and infant care that survived to the present day. And it is, frankly, astonishing. Soranus describes how to choose a competent midwife, how to manage a difficult delivery, how to handle the umbilical cord, how to assess whether a newborn was even worth raising. His work was so advanced that some of his recommendations weren't meaningfully improved upon for over 1,000 years. Soranus gave specific instructions for examining a newborn. The midwife was to check whether the baby cried with vigor, whether its limbs were properly formed, whether it responded normally to stimulation. This wasn't sentimental, it was a brutal triage. A baby that passed was a baby worth the enormous investment of keeping alive. A baby that failed faced a much darker fate, which we'll come back to. If the newborn passed inspection, the midwife performed the first ritual of Roman life. The baby was washed, and not in plain water. Soranus and others describe sprinkling the infant with fine salt, sometimes mixed with honey, olive oil, or barley juice, to clean and, they believed, toughen the delicate skin. Then came the swaddling, and here the Romans had an entire philosophy. Swaddling in Rome was not just wrapping a baby in a blanket for warmth. It was considered medical engineering. Roman caregivers believed a newborn's body was soft, formless, almost unfinished, like clay that hadn't set. They thought that if you didn't physically shape and support the limbs, the child would grow up deformed, with crooked legs and a twisted spine. So they wrapped infants tightly in long woolen bands, binding the arms to the sides and the legs straight, limb by limb, until the entire body was bound into a firm, rigid little package. The baby would be unwrapped daily, given a warm bath and a massage, and then bound right back up. Soranus instructed that this binding continue for the first 40 to 60 days of life, with the swaddling gradually loosened over time as the child was believed to firm up. Now here's the genuinely interesting part. We tend to look at this and wince. It sounds restrictive, even cruel. But modern research has found that swaddling, done correctly, actually has real benefits. It calms infants, reduces excessive crying, helps them sleep, and, crucially, encourages them to sleep on their backs, which we now know dramatically reduces the risk of sudden infant death. The Romans had no idea why it worked. They had the wrong theory entirely. There was no danger of a baby's legs growing crooked from being unbound. But the practice itself stumbled onto something genuinely protective. They were right by accident, which happens a lot in this story. Now we arrive at the single most chilling part of Roman infancy, and there's no way to tell this story honestly without it. In Rome, being born did not guarantee you the right to live. That decision belonged to one person, the pater familias, the male head of the household, usually the father. After the birth, the newborn was traditionally placed on the ground at his feet, and then everyone waited. If the father bent down and physically lifted the child up into the air, that gesture, known as tollere liberos, to raise up the child, meant acceptance. This baby would be raised as a member of the family. It would live. If he did not lift the child, the baby was rejected, and a rejected newborn in Rome faced abandonment. This is one of the hardest realities of the ancient world to absorb. Roman law and custom permitted the exposure of unwanted infants, leaving them outside, in a public place, at a rubbish heap, or at a known site where abandoned babies were left. Reasons varied. The baby might have a visible deformity. The family might be too poor to feed another mouth. The child might be illegitimate. And, in a pattern documented across the ancient world, the baby was disproportionately likely to be a girl because sons were valued more highly. But here's where it gets even stranger and darker. Many of these abandoned infants did not simply die. They were collected by slave traders or by the wealthy and raised as slaves. There were written contracts preserved on papyrus dealing with exactly this. The cold economics of it are staggering. An abandoned baby was a nearly free source of a future slave, requiring only the cost of a wet nurse to keep it alive. Survival for these children came at the price of a lifetime of bondage. I'm not telling you this to be grim for its own sake. I'm telling you because you cannot understand how Romans kept babies alive without understanding that, for them, keeping a baby alive was a decision, a calculated, sometimes merciless one, not an automatic given. And that decision shaped everything that came after. So let's say the baby is accepted. The father lifts the child. Now the real work of survival begins, and it begins with milk. There was no formula in the ancient world. There were no safe substitutes for breast milk. If a baby could not be breastfed, that baby was in mortal danger. So feeding was, quite literally, life or death. Many Roman mothers breastfed their own children, and influential voices insisted they should. The philosopher Favorinus, the writer Tacitus, the biographer Plutarch, all of them praised maternal breastfeeding and looked down on the alternative. But among the wealthy, especially during the imperial era, that alternative was extremely common. The wet nurse, in Latin, the nutrix. A wet nurse was a woman, very often an enslaved woman, who breastfed someone else's baby. In elite Roman households, having a nutrix was almost a status symbol. And this was such an established part of Roman life that there was apparently a specific location in Rome, a landmark called the Columna Lactaria, literally the milk column, that may have been a place where wet nurses could be found and hired. And the Romans did not treat this casually. Soranus laid out detailed criteria for choosing a good wet nurse. She should be healthy, of good character, neither too young nor too old, emotionally steady, and Greek was often preferred, partly because Romans believed the baby would absorb the Greek language along with the milk. There was even a test for the quality of the milk itself, the fingernail test, where a drop of milk was placed on a nail to judge its consistency. too watery, or too thick, and the milk was considered unsuitable. We even have an actual wet nursing contract that survived, dating to 13 BC. It's for a nurse named Didyma, hired to feed an abandoned infant taken in as a slave by a woman named Isidora. The contract specifies her pay and her duties, and it stipulates, in writing 2,000 years ago, that she must take proper care of herself and the child, must not injure her milk, must not sleep with a man, must not become pregnant, and must not nurse any other baby at the same time. The level of detail tells you everything. Roman society understood, with absolute clarity, that the milk supply was the thread the baby's life hung from. Let's talk about the wider world that newborn was surviving in, because the threats were everywhere and relentless. Roman cities were dense, hot, and from a modern hygiene standpoint, profoundly dangerous for an infant. There was no understanding of germ theory. No one knew that invisible organisms caused disease. Water could be contaminated. Sanitation, even with Rome's famous infrastructure, was wildly inconsistent in the crowded apartment blocks where most ordinary people lived. Diseases that are trivial today, a gut infection, a fever, simple dehydration from diarrhea, could kill a Roman infant within days, and the statistics reflect this brutally. The best estimates suggest that around 1 in 3 Roman children died in their first year, and many of those in the first few weeks. By some estimates, up to a third or more didn't survive to age 5 at all. To keep the population stable against these losses, Roman women needed to have an enormous number of pregnancies. On average, a woman might give birth 5 or 6 times in her life, knowing that several of those children would not survive. This wasn't an abstraction. We have the words of real Romans who lived it. Fronto, the tutor of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, wrote about losing 5 of his own children. And the detail that breaks your heart is how he describes it. He lost each one separately, he said, each new child born at the very moment he was grieving the loss of another. That was a normal Roman life. Not a tragedy that befell one unlucky family, the baseline expectation. So how did Romans psychologically and practically cope with a world this dangerous for their children? The answer is that they built an enormous apparatus of ritual, religion, and protection around the infant. And some of it, again, accidentally worked. Remember that nameless 8-day-old we started with? On the 8th day for a girl, or the 9th for a boy, came one of the most important ceremonies in Roman life, the dies lustricus, the day of purification. This was when the baby was finally given its name, formally welcomed into the family, and presented to friends and relatives. Offerings were made to the gods. The child officially became a person. The reason this happened on day 8 or 9, rather than at birth, is haunting once you understand it. So many babies died in those first few days that Romans waited until the worst of the danger had passed before investing the child with a name and an identity. The delay was a buffer against grief, a way of not fully bonding with a child who might not survive the week. At the dies lustricus, the child was given a protective amulet. For boys, it was the bulla, a rounded gold locket worn around the neck. For girls, a similar amulet called the lunula. Among poorer families who couldn't afford gold, the bulla might just be a knotted leather cord. Its purpose was to ward off the evil eye and malevolent spirits, which Romans genuinely believed preyed on vulnerable infants. The child would wear it throughout childhood as a shield against unseen harm. To us, this is superstition, but think about what it actually did. It marked the child as precious and protected. It publicly bound the entire community to the child's welfare. It gave grieving, terrified parents a framework, a sense of agency in a world where they were otherwise helpless against the invisible forces killing their children. And we know just how deeply Romans feared for their babies because of what they left behind in their temples. Thousands of small terracotta figures of swaddled infants, offered to the gods as prayers for a healthy child, or as thanks for one who survived. Archaeologists have recovered these swaddled baby votives across the Roman world. Each one represents a parent standing in a temple, terrified, bargaining with the divine for the life of a child. Now here's the part that flips the whole story on its head, the part nobody expects. We look back at Roman infancy and we see the horror, the 1 in 3 death rate, the abandoned babies, the legal power of life and death. And all of that is real, but buried inside their practices is something genuinely humbling. A surprising amount of what Romans did to keep babies alive was, by accident or hard-won experience, actually effective. The swaddling that we wince at? It reduced infant crying and encouraged back sleeping, which we now know protects against sudden infant death. The intense focus on the quality and reliability of breast milk? That was, given the total absence of safe alternatives, exactly the right thing to obsess over. Breast milk delivered nutrition and crucial immune protection that nothing else could. The communal multi-caregiver structure, mothers, wet nurses, grandmothers, slaves, and extended household, all involved in raising the child, meant a Roman baby was rarely left alone, rarely without a warm body and watchful eyes. The rituals, the amulets, the naming ceremonies bound entire communities to the survival of each child. The Romans understood something we have partly forgotten, that keeping a fragile new life alive was never the job of one exhausted person alone. It was the work of an entire household, an entire community, an entire web of people, gods, and rituals, all pointed at a single, tiny goal: get this baby to its next birthday. And yet, here's the sobering counterweight, and it deserves to be said plainly. For all their sophistication, for all Soranus's brilliance, and all those careful rituals, Roman babies still died at a rate that would be considered a catastrophic public health emergency today. 1 in 3. The single greatest thing that ever happened for keeping babies alive wasn't a Roman ritual. It was germ theory, clean water, vaccines, and modern medicine. The things that took infant mortality from 1 in 3 down to, in much of the world today, less than 1 in 100. That collapse in child death is one of the greatest achievements in all of human history, and nothing about Rome's ingenuity should make us forget it. So let's go back to that nameless baby on the floor, 8 days old, waiting. Now you know what it took. The skilled hands of a midwife trained in the wisdom of Soranus, the salt in the warm baths, the tight woolen bands that by sheer luck helped you sleep safely, the father's decision to lift you from the ground and let you live, the milk, your mother's, or a wet nurse bound by contract to keep you fed and keep you alive, the amulet hung around your neck to fight off the unseen, the whole community gathering on your naming day, finally willing to believe you might stay. And behind all of it, the quiet, constant, terrifying arithmetic of a world where 1/3 of all babies didn't make it, and where everything Romans did, every ritual and rule and remedy, was a response to that fear. You exist because somewhere back along your line, a Roman baby won that gamble, and then their child did, and their child's child. An unbroken chain of survivors, each one beating odds that should make you grateful for every boring, miraculous, modern thing. The clean water, the vaccine, the doctor, that we now take completely for granted. The Romans didn't have any of that. What they had was each other, a handful of rituals, a great deal of fear, and an absolute refusal to let go of the fragile little lives they'd decided were worth keeping. And somehow, against the odds, often enough, it was enough.